Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ophthalmology Business Podcast. We help you develop your ideal practice with help of other doctors and experts. The topics we cover include marketing, management, leadership, recruitment, HR, mindsets, and more. I am Guido Piquet, one of the co-hosts of this podcast. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to join the Ophthalmology Business Academy at www.obacademy.org. The membership is on us, and it's our gift to you. Today, I'm excited to talk to Sean Hanlon, the founder and CEO of CoFi, about the patient payment experience in 2023 and beyond. Let's jump in. Hey, Sean, how's it going today?
It's doing great, Guido. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great to have you. There's a lot going on in the field, and just wanted to get the listeners a chance to talk to someone that I highly respect. So thank you very much for joining us today. Could you start off just by giving a little introduction about yourself and talk about your experience in ophthalmology and kind of how you got here?
Absolutely. So my background is I've been in healthcare on sort of the commercial side of healthcare for almost my entire career in sales, marketing, and product development and executive roles, working in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, software services, really kind of the whole gamut. Always focused on working with physicians, bringing technology to their practices. I got into ophthalmology in 2016 when I co-founded and co-ran really a very niche consultancy, sort of a software-enabled consultancy that worked with ophthalmology practices to help them understand their referral markets, their local referral markets, at a kind of level beyond what they understood them to be, and then ultimately to help connect them to new and potential referrers to their practice to grow referral volume, surgical volume, and revenues. It's a very niche consultancy, but worked with probably almost 100 practices and 4 or 5 years that I did that. That was before co-founding, and I'm now the CEO of CoFi, a payments company that is helping ophthalmology practices, which we'll talk a little bit about.
Yeah, for sure. And what you mentioned about practices and helping referral networks, in my experience from going to many meetings, I find that to be a hot topic. So many ophthalmology practices and providers really want more information about that process as a whole, because it can be daunting. And, when it comes to compliance, when it comes to, attracting those other outside physicians to work with you as a partner, there's a lot of things to consider. So I think that's a very interesting way of line of work, and thank you for your help in that field. So let's talk about today's topic a little more, the patient payment experience. It's not really talked about often. I want to ask you, why is it important to talk about? I can tell you from my experience as a practice administrator that the patient payment experience can be confusing for most patients. Most patients have a hard time understanding what their insurance covers. They have a hard time understanding, what an upgrade covers, what if they were referred by another doctor, what should they pay that provider? They don't really truly understand, and we have to do everything that we can do as ophthalmology practices to make that better and more efficient and easier for those patients. So why is this such an important topic?
It's important in part for everything you just described. But if you think about it, so many ophthalmology practices are, offering premium technology, right? Premium IOLs, premium refractive services, premium products like, laser, femtosecond laser surgeries and so forth, that they care a lot about, because they're selling premium services, they care a lot about the patient experience from the moment the patient engages with the practice, whether it be online or when they set foot in their practice, all the way through the care episodes, which can span multiple visits, through the surgery and post-operative care, and even on the way out with, follow-up marketing and so forth. There's a lot of focus on making that experience as as pleasant, enjoyable, professional as it can be, especially in a premium practice. And where it falls apart so often is sort of the last foot, not the last mile, but the last foot, which is when the patient has to pay. And it's to no fault of anybody's. As you highlighted, you have the insurance companies are involved. But what complicates things is multiple parties are often billing the patient, especially when it comes to surgical procedures. And it can be confusing for patients. It can result in multiple payment moments in time where they have to pay different parties. And as nice as you try to make that patient's overall experience, in the end, it falls apart, and every patient is subjected to sort of that kind of like traditional U.S. healthcare consumer experience, where who do I owe what, and why am I getting this bill in the mail, and what's this EOB for, and it's an overlooked and kind of neglected part of that overall patient experience.
Right. Yeah, and it seems that, especially from a timing perspective, maybe you can talk a little bit about the timing of when patients pay, because in our experience, it seems that once a patient pays one time, they feel like they've already paid for everything that they've been provided, and they may not fully understand the different components of it. So especially when it comes to surgical procedures, because that can get complicated. So can you talk a little bit more about when it comes to that experience for surgical procedures and how we can make that better?
The best example is a surgical procedure. So let's take a cataract procedure. Let's assume the patient is getting a premium IOL package, right, to go with it. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it's co-managed with an external optometrist. So that patient is going to have minimally 3 parties that they have to pay, right? The ophthalmology practice, both for the premium fees, but also for any patient responsibility items from the covered portion of that cataract procedure. So that we're going to owe the ophthalmology practice for, again, the premium fees and any deductible or copay or coinsurance. The second stop is the surgery center, that very often is a separate payment event, especially when the surgery center isn't wholly owned by the practice or is far enough geographically away from the clinic. And again, there's the lens fee and any patient responsibility items from the insured portion of that procedure. And those 2 payments can happen, there could be time between those 2 payments. The patient may pay the practice one day, and the surgery might not be for a couple of weeks or a week out. And they get a phone call from the surgery center, or they show up at the surgery center that morning and they're confronted with that expensive bill, right? Because it at least has a toric lens in it, if not something more expensive. And then if it's co-managed, that the patient let's just say the patient sees the optometrist, week 1 after the second eye to start their co-management period. There could be a month that passes from when the patient pays the ophthalmology practice and when they are standing at the optometrist's office, and they get confronted with a, $600, $700 bilateral co-management fee, which doesn't really add up in their minds because they're there for kind of a checkup, as they would think about it. So there's 3 distinct payments in this scenario. There's at least 2 if it's not co-managed, and there's time between them all. And as well as you explain it to them, as well as your staff explains to them what the total cost of the procedure is, what they're going to owe each party, they can forget, they can be frustrated, they may not show up with payment, right? And even if it all goes smoothly, as the average American healthcare consumer, we're still left with a bitter taste in our mouth at the end of it, right? Even if you remembered it all and had to make these payments, it doesn't feel good.
Right. No, I agree. And it feels like you can provide the patient an extremely superior outcome result. They're all throughout the practice, and then when they get to the payment portion, if there's some snafu there, it can sour their entire experience. So I think we as ophthalmology practices need to be very aware of how important this step in that process is, because we don't want that to happen. We want patients to be happy and not come away with an amazing surgical outcome, but not talking well of our practice because of that payment experience that they had. That can be very confusing. And then can I ask you too about, because it's what I'm hearing is streamlining. I think what practices need to consider is to streamline their payment process and to make it better for a better experience for patients. What about ophthalmology practices themselves and just the people that it impacts on this side? How can it make it better for them?
Well, I think there's a few ways that practices have traditionally kind of gone about trying to make this easier for everybody, for themselves, for the patient, and even for their surgical partners, let's call them, right? So surgery centers and ODs. One is, and this is not recommended because it runs afoul of compliance, rules and regulations, which is that the ophthalmology practice might tell the patient, okay, this procedure is going to cost you X. You're going to pay us, and then that practice is then paying, essentially writing checks to or reconciling with the surgery center and sending a check to the optometrist. From a compliance perspective, I think everyone understands that's a no-no. Patients should pay each party for the services they're performing. It's the general, kind of guidepost on it. And you can run afoul of, or at least optically, there could be the bad optics of running afoul of the kickback statute if you're writing a check to even the surgery center, let alone the optometrist. So that's one way that practices try to streamline it and try to make things more convenient for the patient. There's good intention behind that, but again, there's problems downstream if you do it that way. The other thing we see, and this isn't quite as common as things it used to be, which is the ophthalmology practice sort of facilitating the payment for the other parties. So the patient runs their card at your office, Guido, and your staff then, captures that credit card information and sends an authorization form to the surgery center or to the optometrist, right? And that's a bit of an administrative burden, and it's kind of off-putting to the patient. But that's another way that some practices, work to try to make it a little bit easier. And then backing out from all of that, there's also, I think, more and more practices and facilities are sort of pre-adjudicating or pre-flighting the patient eligibility, right? Trying to understand ahead of time or at the moment of collection, what is the patient's copay? What is left on their deductible, right? Is there co-insurance? And trying to be sure that you can capture all of that along with any premium fees at one point in time, again, to try to make things easier for the patient.
Yeah,
those are some of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think one thing that you mentioned in there, which I'd like to just reiterate, is the compliance portion, because I think that many practices don't really realize the risk they're putting themselves, especially with the more focused attention on compliance in terms of ophthalmology and optometry practices over the last few years, with some of the lawsuits going on in the country, right, and how that payment really needs to be separated. And there's a lot of practices that are even in our backyard, and I know because a lot of the optometrists we work with will say, well, this practice is going to pay me X, and that's when it draws a red flag. And I said, well, first off, we're not paying you anything. The patient is paying you for the services you provide. And so I think there's a misunderstanding on many parties. And so I think that's an important thing to note, is that compliance of making sure that practices understand how to do that the right way. So in your experience dealing with this issue, are there people out there that are doing it the right way? Like, what are some of your experiences seeing people successfully streamline?
Yeah, so you mean in terms of overall?
Yeah, just overall payment process and streamlining the patient experience from a payment perspective and the process of practice. Or are you seeing many practices do it the right way, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so a growing number of practices are starting to use tools that facilitate the ability to do sort of multi-party payments. So enabling the patient to have a single payment episode or payment event. but yet have each party involved collecting from the patient. So there's software that does that, and the downstream benefits of that sort of thing, or that approach, are certainly compliance, right, ensuring that the patient's paying each party separately, as you highlighted, but also there's the surgical partners, as I call them, the ASC and the ODs. They really appreciate the concept, right, because it eliminates a collections moment for them, right? The collections moment is sort of being facilitated by the surgical practice, by the ophthalmology practice, and the surgery center doesn't have that collections moment, at least for the premium lens fee. The OD doesn't have what they describe when the ODs have to collect their co-management fee at the post-operative visit. They routinely describe that as an uncomfortable collections moment. Again, the patient's paid for everything else a week, sometimes weeks in advance, and they forget, or they kind of minimize what they have to do at the OD's office, and it just doesn't add up that it's hundreds and hundreds of dollars, right, for bilateral co-management. So the ODs really love to not have that to collect at that moment. They like to collect in advance too, right? And so that, we see practices that are adopting this approach, and it reduces the burden on their staff, right? It ensures compliance, and it's making their the co-managing ODs and the facility they work with, happier too.
Right. I think that another important thing to mention, you mentioned about that uncomfortable conversation, which I also hear quite frequently. I just like to remind practices that in order to have a streamlined process and collect, the other part of that is the disclosure. So you really have to do a great job of, when you're streamlining your process, to not make it feel like the patient is unaware of what they're paying and who they're paying. So my biggest recommendation usually is a patient disclosure. Tell the patient when they're in the ophthalmology office exactly what services are being provided, exactly what each party is collecting for the service that they're providing, and then let them know that payment process will be streamlined for their convenience.
Yeah.
And,
the ophthalmology practice is in a unique position in this sort of ecosystem of providers that are involved in the procedure, right? They know every party's fees. They know their own fees. They know the surgery center's fee for the lens. They know if there's a co-management fee, they know what it is. Even if the OD is setting their own rates for co-management, the ophthalmology practice has to know what they are, because they have to be able to tell the patient, this is what this procedure is going to cost you, right?
Right.
So yeah, it's critical that the practice is able to disclose to the patient what the procedure is going to cost, what each party is going to charge them, and then the variance is in how the insurance company responds to the billing, right? That's the one thing that can be left as an unknown. But that at least tends to be the smaller amount, right? For any premium fees, all of those fees are known up front. That should be easy to disclose to the patient.
Right. And so let's focus back on the patient experience. Our practice, patient experience is an initiative that we take every year. We try to make that better. This year, we put even more focus on it. So from your experience and dealing with other practices that are trying to streamline the patient payment process, what has been the response from the patients? Like, what are they saying?
So it's interesting. Patients, I keep using this phrase, the average American healthcare consumer, right? So the typical American healthcare consumer is used to there being multiple bills from different parties. We sent my young daughter in for a sleep study. I forget, it was like sometime in 2021, and 11 months later, we got a bill from the company that read the result, right? And what that means is that company, billed and maybe went back and forth with the insurance company 5 times, and in the end, it was an amount that we owed, but we just couldn't believe it. And this was like the 4th party that billed us for a sleep study that happened with one doctor in one building, and it didn't make sense, right? But people are used to this. They're used to there being multiple parties involved. So patients are used to that. If they're told about it, that makes all the sense in the world. What we found that patients want is, if you go online to buy a flight in a car rental in a hotel, you can do it all at once, right? With one swipe. And that's what we found that patients want. They want the ability to do that when they're purchasing healthcare services too. And so the response to the idea of a sort of a single payment event for the majority of what the patient owes has been almost kind of like negligible. There hasn't been much response, meaning there's no negative response, because it all works and it makes sense to the patient. And there isn't this necessarily positive, like delightful response either, because you're kind of just meeting expectations. Like, I can buy multiple things at once, right? But that's good, because what's kind of getting, eliminated is the frustration of the patient,
Right.
the complaints of the patient, the confusion of the patient. So that's going away. But the actual response, is basically neutral. Like, oh, okay, this makes sense. This is great. And they move on.
And sometimes that's the best response of all, because if you don't hear him complaining about it, then it's going as it should be. It's like,
Right.
when you walk in the door and you flip the light switch, you expect it to come on. You don't praise the person that put the switch in, you just expect it to come on. So I think sometimes patients have those, those expectations that things should work a certain way. I should understand what I'm supposed to be paying my physician.
Right.
And so I appreciate that. I think that's a
Yeah.
very great way to look at it in terms of what the expectations are from a physician side, in terms of providing that experience for the patient, that is the expectation. It should be clear. It should be straightforward. So thank you for that. And so besides, we talked about a better patient experience, talked about a better experience for the practice side. Is there anything else from a patient payment experience that you think is worth mentioning?
I think, again, how can you make, this, I call it like the last foot of your overall experience better, right, for the patient. And while trying to kind of reduce the administrative burden on your staff, and also doing it in a way that is appreciated by the other parties that you're working with, right? The ASC, anesthesia company, if they're involved, and optometrists, knowing, of course, that, in particular, the optometrist, right? Because that's a business relationship, and there's a lot of, desire for both sides to keep each other happy. I think it all kind of rolls up into, it affects all of those constituents.
And so what do you think the types of practices that can benefit the most from really understanding and trying to revamp their patient payment experience?
I think any practice where your current construct is the patient is making more than one payment, right, for a surgery, even if it's just 2 sets of copays or 2 sets of patient responsibility items for a non-premium cataract surgery. And then beyond that, if you do a lot of premium IOLs and premium services, surgical services, even if you don't co-manage, it's a no-brainer to think about how to make that easier. These are high dollar payments. Having patients having to make 2 or more is frustrating. And lastly, any practice that's co-managing with ODs, if there's a solution to enable a single payment event for the patient, with each party collecting separately for all of the known costs, it's a no-brainer for practices that co-manage to consider a solution like that.
Right. And if you're a provider or a practice administrator listening to this podcast and you're thinking, well, that sounds great, but I don't really have the resources to kind of think about this topic, or I'd love to do it, but I just don't have the time. What are some of the ways that a practice can get started getting some help streamlining their payment process?
So I would, direct them to CoFiMD.com and have them, take a look at the information there. It's both, information about multi-party payments, but also about all the topics we just discussed, just content about all the topics we just discussed there as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks, Sean. I just want to say thank you for your time today. I've known you, and I think you're a great resource. So anybody who gets a chance to talk to Sean, I think is lucky because they'll get a lot of great information. So thank you for joining us today. We had a great topic about the patient payment experience in 2023 and beyond. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, kindly share it with your friends on social media. Also, please don't forget to write a review on iTunes or Google Play. Your reviews will help other doctors and practice owners find us. Till we meet again, wishing all of you an amazing week ahead. Thank you.